In this video, we're going to elaborate on this idea of structural unemployment, which is a component of the natural rate of unemployment. So recall from the earlier video that the natural rate of unemployment, which is the unemployment that we see over the long term, is composed of two things. One is frictional unemployment and the other is structural unemployment. We talked about frictional unemployment in the earlier video, but in this video, we're going to focus on structural unemployment. So structural unemployment is a type of unemployment that typically occurs when there are fewer jobs than workers because wages kept above equilibrium. And there are three reasons for this, which we're going to discuss one by one. There are minimum wage laws that can affect wages. There can be labor unions, or there can be efficiency wages. So here we're going to start with thinking about a demand and supply diagram. In this case, we're going to think about workers. So on our x-axis, we have labor, or the number of workers. Right, so this is sort of the quantity that we have on the x-axis, quantity of workers or number of workers. And on the y-axis, we have price of that worker, which is the wage rate. Okay, so this is the wage rate. And you have your standard demand and supply curves. You have an upward sloping supply curve for workers. So this is to say that as the wage rate or the price of a worker goes up, they're willing to supply more in terms of their hours. Okay, this could be, so on the x-axis you could have number of workers or labor hours, really. Okay, and so when we think about demand, this is downward sloping. This is to say that on the demand side, employers are trying to hire workers, and as the wage rate increases, they're going to hire less workers. So there's that inverse relationship between workers and the number of workers and the wage rate when you look at it from the demand side. Okay, and you have equilibrium attained when demand and supply are equal. Okay, so this is the wage rate, let's call it W star, that would clear the market, clear the labor market. And in this case, no one is unemployed, okay? But you could have a scenario where there are some policies or some social institutions that cause the wage rate not to be at W star, but at something that's higher than W star. So let's think about this guy right here, and let's call this W1. And now notice there is this gap between demand and supply. So this gap right here between demand and supply. Demand, obviously, if you drop a vertical line down over here, this is demand is less than supply. Okay, so there's an excess supply at W1. Excess supply of workers at W1. And this difference between demand and supply is the unemployment. Okay, so again, going back to what causes structural unemployment, this is to say that the demand, right, that we are measuring here, this is the number of jobs, right? And this is how many workers are out there. This is the supply. And so our jobs are less than the number of workers, or the supply of workers in the labor market. And so this is usually because of three reasons. that you can literally use this diagram and explain all of these three reasons. The first reason is that there could be minimum wage laws that lead to the equilibrium that may exceed the equilibrium wage for the least skilled or experienced workers. Okay, and that causes structural unemployment. But this group is typically a small part of the labor force, so the minimum wage can't really explain most of the unemployment that is caused by this. Okay, so again, you could think about a policy which drives minimum wage to W1, and that causes some sort of unemployment for the unskilled labor. The second idea here is that labor unions, which are usually these associations or groups of people that bargain with employer over wages and benefits and working conditions, could exert their power or their union power to negotiate higher wages for workers. And this may happen. Now, in the United States, we've seen a decline of unions, okay? But typically, if you have a unionized workforce for a particular company, they're going to negotiate higher wages. And again, that could be a potential reason for why we may not be operating at W star, but we operate at something like W1, which is higher than W star. And again, you have unemployment. So you know, unions can raise the wage above equilibrium, and typically people who remain employed in those companies that have unions are the insiders, and they're better off. But people who are outsiders, or workers who lose their jobs, are worse off. Okay, but there's a big debate in economics over whether unions are good or bad. The critics of unions, they say that unions act like cartels. They raise wages above equilibrium, which causes unemployment and can depress wages in non-union labor markets. But the advocates of labor unions say that you're actually able to fight the market power of large corporations, large firms, and make the firms more responsive to any needs that workers have. Okay, so there are different stories around this, and not a lot of consensus. The third type of reason for structural unemployment is this theory of efficiency wages. And efficiency wages are due to the fact that firms sometimes may voluntarily pay above equilibrium wages because they think that is going to boost worker productivity. And there are different versions of this efficiency wage theory that suggest that there are different reasons for why firms may pay high wages. One idea is that, this should be health. So one idea here is that you may have an outcome that's desirable for firms or corporations, that you are trying to counter this poor nutrition that could be something that workers are affected by, and paying higher wages would allow workers to eat better, make them healthier and more productive, right? So by paying more, right, a higher wage, you're going to eat better and be more productive. Okay, the second reason or second theory behind why firms might pay efficiency wages could be worker turnover. So always when you're hiring new people, typically hiring them has a cost, and training them also takes up time, and the corporation or the company has to incur time and effort to do that. So in other words, hiring and training new workers is costly. And so paying high wages gives workers more incentive to stay and would reduce turnover. So you would have, with higher wages, you reduce your turnover. Okay, and so you're not constantly hiring and training new people because you're retaining that workforce. The third factor here is worker quality. So sometimes when you look at a job ad and it says, well, you're going to be paid $150,000, sometimes it could deter applicants who think they're not worthy of that wage or that salary, and offering higher wages could attract better quality applicants. And improve the firm's workforce. Okay, and the last factor here is worker effort. So, you always, when you're working, you have the option of working and shirking. So shirkers are people who don't work and who are lazy at their job. And if you're paid a lot more than the market rate, then typically you would work hard, and that's sort of an incentive, because if you lose your job, then you know that there are not enough jobs to go around, and it would be hard for you to find work. So you would tend to just work hard and not get fired. Okay, so worker effort, pay higher wages. And this is going to perhaps try to increase worker effort. Okay, the last thing we're going to look at is an application, and we want to think about frictional unemployment. So this is a question not just on frictional, but you can also apply it to structural unemployment and think about unemployment as a whole. So we want to look at different scenarios, and this is a good time to pause the video and work through these questions. In 5 scenarios, you want to ask yourself what would happen to frictional unemployment. So the first part says that the government imposes the minimum wage. Now, we know that if the government imposes the minimum wage, this is going to increase structural unemployment. Right? It does nothing to frictional unemployment because minimum wage laws are a factor that affect structural unemployment and not frictional unemployment. The second part here is saying that the government increases unemployment benefits. Okay? When there is an increase in unemployment benefits, like the situation that is right now, this is likely going to increase frictional unemployment, right? This is an incentive for people to get a little more relaxed, because if they've been laid off from their job, they can be rest assured that they will be paid some unemployment insurance and they can look for work. So it is going to increase frictional unemployment. Okay, and part C says a new law restricts the formation of labor unions. So if there is a new law that is banning labor unions, these are likely to reduce structural, or this type of policy is likely to reduce structural unemployment, but it will not have an effect on frictional unemployment. Now, 4 says more workers post resumes on Indeed.com. Now, you know right off the bat that the type of unemployment that results from workers trying to find a job that best matches their skill set is frictional unemployment. So anytime you're expediting that process of job search by any type of policy is going to reduce frictional unemployment. Okay, and the last question here says that let's imagine there are sectoral shifts and that becomes more frequent due to automation. This is something that could happen because of COVID-19, where firms cannot get workers, but they hire robots to do their jobs, and there is an increase or a big push towards automation, and sectoral shifts become more frequent. And again, sectoral shifts affect frictional unemployment, and so this is going to increase frictional unemployment and not reduce it. And so that's the end of the chapter.